Okay, so we're at part 2 of Pamela, the second half of volume 1, and she's been kidnapped to another house that is sort of the inversion of the first. She has Mrs. Jukes instead of Mrs. Jarvis, and she's held captive explicitly, and she doesn't have Mr. B there to torment her, but Mrs. Jukes does that instead. And instead of all of the servants who love her, she has only Parson Williams who is trying to help her. And in many ways, this is a much more interesting part of volume 1, not just story-wise, which I kind of outlined, but because the letters that go back and forth are so much more complicated. She's still writing mostly to her parents, but there are also letters to and from Mr. B, to and from Mr. B and Mrs. Jukes, the Parson Williams and Pamela, and these different audiences or different narratees to the different letters allow us to move in a variety of into a variety of positions and maybe get some practice looking at Pamela from different points of view, both in her use of the letters and in her actions. Pamela seems at this point in the story very savvy. She's doing a really good job of protecting herself, looking out for her own interests. And rhetorically, especially when we get to the section where we get Mr. B's articles and then her responses to them, starting on page 188, we can see how savvy or canny she really is, which makes it harder for us to read her as absolutely naive. Now, whether or not we want to think about this as an inconsistency, or if we want to read back into volume 1, the first part of volume 1, to try to make it coherent is up to us. There's no reason at this point in the history of the novel to insist that a character be totally coherent. But it does make perhaps for some more interesting tension between Pamela as naive and Pamela as savvy, if those are the two ways we might read the novel. We also get this weird moment, and speaking of being unable to read this coherently, where Pamela says multiple times, where's the first time? Maybe the first time is on 196. She says, to be sure, he, the master, is a handsome, fine gentleman. What pity his heart is not as good as his appearance. Why can't I hate him? Why can't you hate him, Pamela? The first one is on 179. Just now we heard that he had liked to have been drowned in crossing a stream a few days ago and pursuing his game. What is the matter with all his ill usage of me that I cannot hate him? To be sure, I am not like other people. Well, she's not like other people, right? She's this paragon of virtue. And then there's another reference later on. So we see this, if we want to read her as having some psychological realism that makes her like a real person, we have this other conflict within her where she loves, but then also totally distrusts, for a lot of really good reasons, this guy who now professes to love her, wants to make her a legitimate mistress, whatever that means, and she's trying to work that out. The last thing I want to say about this section is that the letters that she writes, she starts sewing into her dress in earnest, so that her whole dress must be covered in letters. And this is where we start to find, if we want to look for it this way, the impossibility of separating Pamela the book that we're reading from Pamela, the girl that we're reading about. Both of them are bodies of text. And we are reading her letters in this way that is very aggressive and invasive, just the way Mr. B would read her letters. It's maybe horrible, but also kind of cool.